Good afternoon. Welcome to the Wellness Collective. We are excited to have as our guest expert, the Reverend Dr. DeForest B. Soaries Jr., whose pastoral ministry focuses on spiritual growth, educational excellence, and economic empowerment. Dr. Soaries is a national leader and noted pioneer in faith-based community development and personal economic empowerment. He will be discussing dealing with financial stress. Welcome, Dr. Soaries.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much to the Howard community. I feel so special. I was in exile for about 5 years, and now I've been with you 2 days in a row. What a blessing it is. I send a daily meditation to those who subscribe. And just ironically, today, I had the privilege of writing something that is relevant for our topic of financial stress because I've written books about finance and because of a CNN documentary that was done on our ministry some years ago. I've become pretty well known in certain circles, particularly church circles, for strategies and programming and content that helps people address their personal financial situation. What's profound for me is that I've never taken a course in finance. I've never earned a degree. I have no licenses, and I urge people to talk to experts. But my expertise in money came in the first instance from being broke and experiencing the kind of stress that I try to help people avoid today. When I was a young man, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and the day he died, my grandmother in northern Jersey was sitting at her dining room table in tears. And when I asked her why she was crying, she said, "They shot Dr. King today." Now, you have to know, my grandmother was a northern domestic worker. She was not an organizer. She was not a protester. She was not an activist. She was what you might call today an accommodationist. She worked hard, prayed, and believed that the Lord would work things out. So I couldn't figure out how this small, quiet Pentecostal woman was so impacted by the death of this activist Baptist preacher who lived 1,000 miles away. But I did decide that day that I wanted my life to be as impactful on somebody as Dr. King's life was on my grandmother. And in doing my research in the following years, I concluded that the Reverend Jesse Jackson was the follow-up to Dr. King. He was the successor to the kind of leadership that Dr. King offered. And I decided as a young man in my early 20s that I wanted to work with Jesse Jackson. What attracted me to Reverend Jackson more than anything was the fact that he had described the civil rights movement as having been completed and that it was over because it won. And he started talking about something called civil rights, economic rights. His vision was to forge a path that helped Black America have access to economic opportunities now that we had the right to vote, the right for fair housing, the right to integrate schools. And that message just resonated with me so significantly that I went to work with him at the tender age of 23 years old. And at that time, the other benefit of having worked with Reverend Jackson was that I had lost faith in the church. I had lost confidence in religion. And the church of my youth was so narrow and so strict and so legalistic that I just opted out of church. I still believed in God and I had faith, but organized religion just wasn't for me. And when I developed this relationship with Reverend Jackson and I had access to people like Otis Moss Jr. and Billy Kyles from Memphis and of course Andrew Young and all the civil rights icons, what I realized was that my problem was I had not discovered an approach to understanding the Bible that was more liberating and less legalistic. And so the two things that happened was I became an activist. I went back to church. I accepted a call to ministry, and it made my dad happy. He was a pastor. He'd been praying for my soul for a long time. But what I discovered about myself was that while I was attempting to be a legitimate pastor of a small church, while I was actively involved in fighting for civil rights, speaking truth to power, what I discovered was that I had a kind of streak of hypocrisy that I can now talk about with some humility. But at that time, it really eluded my consciousness, and the hypocrisy was around money. When I became a preacher, you know how we do it in our tradition. You accept a call from God. Somehow the mystery of heaven intercepts the mundane of earth, and God summons us to higher calling. And so I accepted a call from God, and I was what we call in our tradition licensed to preach. And a license to preach is pretty much the church saying, yeah, we think he's got some potential. And it's the person, in that instance, me, saying, I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to the service of God in ministry. Now, I didn't plan to be a pastor. I became a pastor because my dad died at 47, and I was right by his side. And the church kind of tricked me into becoming the pastor. I was more of an activist minister than I was a priestly minister. But I became a pastor, and I wanted to be honest. I wanted to have integrity. I wanted to do an effective job. So now I was a religious leader, and of course I was an activist. And so as a pastor, I had prayer meeting every Tuesday night. Every Tuesday night we would pray, and the saints would gather and we'd call on the Lord. And then on Thursday night, because I was an activist, we'd have protest meetings. We were always looking for a place to protest, a place to bring light to unfair treatment and to bring truth to power. Speak powerful words that were true about injustice. So every Tuesday night we had prayer meeting. Every Thursday night we had Bible study. And every Tuesday night I would come home after prayer meeting to receive calls from bill collectors. Every Tuesday night. Every Thursday night I'd come home from protest meeting to get calls from different bill collectors. It was so routine that I came to know that the call was coming. I came to expect the call, and in fact, became somewhat friendly with the people who called. The same woman would call me on Tuesday night. The same woman would call me on Thursday night, and we'd have conversations. We talk about the weather. We talk about sports. And then they'd say something like, well, Mr. Soaries, do you think you could send us some money? Now, the reason they were calling was because when I finished high school, without ever asking for it, I received my first credit card. And when I got that credit card, I thought it was a gift from God. It was a credit card to buy gas. And back in those days, and believe this, ask your grandparents, and you'll know I'm telling the truth. In those days, you could buy $1 worth of gas and drive all week long. $1. And I would go to the gas station prior to getting that credit card, and I would buy $1 worth of gas, and I'd drive to school, I'd drive to church, I'd drive to my grandmother's house to get sweet potato pie. And all week long, I could drive back and forth all around town on $1 worth of gas. But when I got that credit card, I drove up the street to the gas station, and the fellow said, welcome back. Here's your $1 worth of gas. I said, oh, no. I don't want $1 worth of gas. He said, well, what do you want? I said, fill it up. He said, fill it up. I said, yeah, fill it up. Because I had that card. And that card empowered and equipped me to buy a full tank of gas for the first time in my life. I was going $1 at a time. I was 18 years old. I had a little part-time job, but I bought $1 worth of gas every week. So I filled it up. I drove to church. I drove to school. I drove to grandma's house for sweet potato pie. but I still had gas. I had so much gas that I would call my friends and offer to drive to the party on Friday night. I had so much gas that when I ran out of places to drive, I just got in the car and drove around town waving at girls. I mean, I was driving because I had all this gas. And I did that for a month. And at the end of the month, I got a bill for $200 and I almost fainted. I said, there was no way I could have bought $200 worth of gas. And what happened at that moment was that my budget went from $4 a month to $200 a month in 1 month just for gas, because when you're spending by credit card, you're not really tracking what you're spending the way when you do $1 at a time. So that credit card, by the way, I paid $20 because the minimum payment was $20. 18 went to interest. So I still owed $398 at the end of 2 months of $200 a month. That credit card turned into a travel card, which turned into a Diners Club card, which turned into all these credit cards. And by the time I became a minister, I was using so much credit. I bought furniture on credit. I did everything on credit. I couldn't even make the minimum payments. And when you don't make the minimum payments, after 2 or 3 months, they'll start calling you. Because I couldn't make the minimum payments, when the bills came, I didn't even open my mail. So here I am now. I'm the pastor of a small church. I'm an activist. I'm working with Jesse Jackson. I'm traveling around the country. I'm doing TV interviews. I'm in the newspaper, and I'm broke. I have no savings. I have no insurance. I have no investments. I'm not preparing then for where I am now, preparing to retire. And this woman called and said, can you send us some money? But she was friendly. Until one Thursday night when I got home from protest meeting, and my normal Thursday night lady was apparently away from work, and the new Thursday night lady called me that I didn't know, and she began screaming at me, yelling at the top of her lungs, you ought to pay your bills on time. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. And I said, lady, listen, first of all, don't yell at me, because you don't know me. You don't know what I do for a living. I don't know where my normal Thursday night lady is, but you're yelling at me, and it seems like you're taking this thing personally. So I told her, I said, listen, I don't owe you any money. I don't know why you're so upset. I owe the company money. And by the way, if I paid my bills on time and everybody else paid their bills on time, you wouldn't have a job. And I was so crazy. I was justifying my delinquency in my bill payments. And I lived like that. I lived like that for 13 years. What made it even worse was that when I became a preacher, I was licensed to preach. A friend of mine said, Soaries, I'm really proud of you. You're on your way to doing great work for God and for the kingdom, but there's only one problem. And I said, well, what's the problem? He said, the problem is you're now a preacher and you're driving a Chevy, and preachers don't drive Chevys. Now, what I should have said to him, my friend, was that my Chevy was paid for. My Chevy worked well, and my small church could not afford to pay me any more money to afford a bigger car. That's what I should have said. But because of the culture, because of my mentality, what I said was, you know what? You're right. I thought about Reverend Jones from Pilgrim Baptist Church. I thought about the pastor of Metropolitan Baptist Church, Reverend Johnson. I thought about the AME preacher, Reverend Owens. They all drove Cadillacs. So here I was in a small church making a meager salary, but I was a preacher. And when my friend said preachers don't drive by Chevys, I said, you're right. I traded in my paid-for Chevy, bought a brand new Cadillac, 4 doors, leather seats, sunroof, and the payments were half of my salary. Some months I couldn't even afford to buy gas to drive the whole month. I was absolutely crunched driving this Cadillac, but I felt like a preacher. That lifestyle lasted for 13 years. And the embarrassment of hoping people don't find out how I'm really living. The hypocrisy of preaching to a congregation of people that God invites us to tithe, and I couldn't even tithe to my own church because I was spending my money before I earned it. The idea that I had more money in my suits, I had nice suits. In fact, when I met my wife, she thought I was rich. It took me 7 years to get myself together before I could afford to get married. But I had a public image of being a leader that was in the making. Young mothers would bring their children up to me, especially their sons, and say, I want my boy to be like you when he grows up. And deep down inside, I knew that I was living a lie. I was living above my means. I was paying my bills late, and I was using credit as if it was income. Now, of course, I was an activist. I worked for Jesse Jackson. I came up in the 60s. So I knew about historic oppression. I knew that our ancestors had worked all of those years without being paid. I knew that America had not kept its promise to Black people. I knew about systemic racism. I knew that we were still the last hired and the first fired. I knew that HBCUs were underfunded. So I knew about all of the social injustices. And I think there was a part of me that justified my own personal lifestyle based on the historic systemic oppression that Black people had experienced. But when it came down to it, the fact was I was addicted to a lifestyle that I could not afford. I was buying neckties that cost much more money than a guy at my level should have been spending on neckties. And I couldn't figure out what was wrong until 13 years in. My Black grandmother died in Brooklyn. She was 80 years old. She had raised 6 children. Her husband was an invalid. He had a stroke after the 6th child. And when she died, she owned 3 houses paid for. Here's a Black woman, 6th grade education, no civil rights, no congressional Black caucus. Here's a Black woman who didn't have a husband to support her. She was essentially a single parent in New York, raising children. And when she died, having only worked as a seamstress, she owned 3 houses, and house number 3, she left to me as her oldest grandchild. The first house I owned, I inherited from my grandmother. And it was at that point I said to myself, if I died right now, all I'd have to leave is credit card bills. And I decided to find out how my grandmother was able to do without all of the tools I had, much more than I was able to do. And Luke 15 changed my life. I basically was living like the prodigal son. I didn't realize it prior to then, because when I was in church school as a child, the whole concept of being a prodigal had more moral implications than it did financial implications. And so I thought as long as I wasn't drinking liquor, chasing women, using drugs, that I was cool. Because I thought the word prodigal was a synonym for immoral. But then when I decided that I had to study my grandmother and figure out how my grandmother was able to do so much more with so much less, what I realized, first of all, was that the dictionary defines prodigal as wasteful extravagance, not immoral. And the young man who could not wait for his father to die to get his inheritance, he had internal challenges that exacerbated his financial stresses. First of all, he was impatient. Dad, I want my money right now. And impatience is what caused me to want a Cadillac before I could afford it. I wanted it then. He was impetuous. When his dad gave him his money, he left. He never talked to a financial professional. He never went down to the temple to pay his tithe. He never talked to his dad to find out what he should do now that he's got this lump sum of money. The Bible says in Luke 15 that this young man got his inheritance and left quickly. He left town to go to the far country right away. And then he was impulsive. He spent every penny. He didn't save any. He didn't invest any. He spent every penny. And I looked at my life and said, I am the prodigal son. And I decided that I had to change. The good news is that I had heard in churches all of my life, preachers preach that one line from Luke 15 that may be the famous black preacher line, and he came to himself. He came to his senses. And I am where I am today, and I do what I do today, and I write what I write today because that young man in Luke 15 taught me, first of all, to speak to myself. That's what the text says. The text says that the young man, after he had a job feeding pigs as a Jewish young man, the text says he said he was talking to himself. And I began talking to myself. The first thing I said to myself is, I got to figure out where my money is going. I said to my dad one time, Dad, I need $50 to payday. He said, well, I work, you work. Why do I have it and you don't? And he said, well, I said, because I don't know where my money goes. And he said, it doesn't leave home while you're sleeping. Your money goes where you take it. I did not know where my money was going. I began speaking to myself by writing down every penny that I spent. And I started looking for what I call in my book now, spending leaks. I was spending money on things I didn't need to spend money on. And then the text says that he saw himself. He looked at himself. Black people in America will spend over $1.2 trillion this year, and much of it will be on things that do not create wealth. And before we receive our reparations, before we offer an analysis on pay disparities, before we critique all of the social policy that exacerbates all of these disparities, we have to see ourselves. Because when we see ourselves, we will honestly do an assessment of what we have and what we do with what we have. We have a beautiful church here, and we have these flags in the lobby that represent the countries that people come from. We've got over 39 flags. People come from all over the world and join our church. And I was walking to look at the flags when they first went up, and sister yelled at me and said, Pastor, you ought to be embarrassed. I said, why? She said, you walked right past me and didn't even say hello. And I looked at her and I said, well, you know, you were blonde last week. I didn't know this was you. If you do the research and see how much we spend on hair, how much men are spending, especially young men, on cars, things that don't appreciate in value, you will realize that a giant step towards our liberation will be just changing the way we use the money that we have. And so the prodigal son, after he spoke to himself and saw himself, it says, I'm going back to my father's house. He surrendered himself to his father's system in addition to going back to his father's house. Our forebears had a system. In many instances, they were forced to have a system. Right there in Washington, D.C., we owned hotels because we couldn't get into the hotels. The institution of Howard University is a part of that larger system where previous generations decided that they would invest their resources in institutions that would not only leave legacy for them, but be a pathway and a bridge for their young children for the future. And if our ancestors had used money the way we use money, there wouldn't be a Howard University at all. There wouldn't be a First Baptist Church, Metropolitan Baptist Church. There wouldn't be a Metropolitan AME Church. And so my financial stresses did not wait for public policy to change, but to rise above my financial stresses required developing a new lifestyle, a new system that took advantage of the opportunities and the resources that I have and that I had in my hand. And so I'm praying that we will not wait for someone to come rescue us from our financial stresses, that we will take advantage of all available opportunities to increase our income, to expand on our professional status, to grow in our career path. But at the end of the day, the only thing worse than not having what we need is not using what we have. I call my system D-free. With a focus on freedom, we always have understood freedom to be both freedom from and freedom to. And so in my own evolution, going from being chased by bill collectors to now being on the board of a bank that lends money to the banks that would not extend me credit because my credit was so bad. What I found in my system was the need to be free from debt. So now I pay as I go. Delinquencies, pay my bills on time and avoid fees and calls from bill collectors. And deficits, living below my means, tithing 10%, saving 10%, investing 10%, so that I could be free to make deposits in my own account, earn dividends from my own investments, and have my name on deeds representing ownership of real estate that grows in value. That's why we call our work and our movement D-Free. And this year we'll be celebrating Juneteenth by inviting all of Black America to an online free platform that leads us through a process towards financial freedom. So thank you. Thank you for the Wellness Initiative. Thank you for connecting to today's topic around financial stress. And thank you in advance for your commitment to freedom. And I pray that as we head towards the celebration of Juneteenth, that we will not only look back and celebrate the freedom from chattel slavery that culminated on June 19th, 1865, but we will also look forward to freedom from financial stress and financial slavery, and that we will support each other in setting financial captives free. So God bless you. Thank you for having me. And I'll turn us back over to Dr. Bernard Richardson.
Thank you, Dr. Soaries. That was very powerful, very meaningful. Now, how can our audience get additional information about your work that you're doing, your books, and what's the best way to do that?
Best way is to go to my website, dbsoaries.com. That's dbsoaries.com. And if you want to know about financial solutions, if you want to know about my course on becoming a corporate director and being paid for it, you can find all of what I'm connected to right there.
Thank you so much. We're looking forward to part 2 of this series. You gave us so much information, really inspired us to go deeper into this process. And I just want to thank you for all the work that you're doing, leading us in this really important, significant work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.